Chaw invites Hank in. Chaw says to Hank, "Sit down, make yourself at home." Hank makes his way through the empty beer cans and sits down. Big Chaw comes in with a 24-pack. They cheers the cans, and Big Chaw downs his in 7 seconds and then cracks another. Big Chaw says, "I got some fine brew in bottles out on the porch. Berry Cobbler Moonshine." And some other beers. Big Chaw and Hank sat on the porch, the evening air heavy with the scent of the bayou. Big Chaw leaned back. "There's someone you need to meet, Hank. She came here a couple years ago. Catherine, come on out here." The door of the shed next door bursts open. Catherine, with a beer bottle already in hand, stumbled out. Her hair was disheveled. "Hey there," she slurred as she stumbles over up the porch stairs. She extended her hand toward Hank, but as she said, "Nice to meet you," she lost her balance and fell backwards down the stairs into the mud. Hank quickly stepped forward to help her up. "You okay?" Catherine giggled as Hank helped her to her feet. Mud drenched her clothes. "Oh, I'm fine. Just had a bit too much, I guess. Or not enough." Big Chaw chuckled. "Catherine, this is Hank. Hank, meet Catherine." Catherine swayed slightly, her eyes barely focusing on Hank. "Well, I am Catherine," she said. Then opened a new beer bottle and chugged half of it in one go. She says, "Gotta keep up with the boys." Hank side-eyed Catherine as she finished the bottle. "Well, I haven't even finished one, so I think you're good," he remarked, glancing at his own bottle. Catherine, now leaning against the wall for support, reached for another beer. "Well, you better catch up," she replied, chugging the rest of her beer and grabbing another one. Big Chaw laughed heartily. "Looks like you've got your work cut out for you, Hank." "Yeah, I guess I do." Catherine, however, didn't slow down. As the evening wore on, Catherine continued drinking at a reckless pace. She had already downed 6 beers before coming out, and now was on her 8th. She stumbled around, laughing loudly at nothing in particular, occasionally leaning on Big Chaw or Hank for support. Hank thinks to himself, "What the fuck am I witnessing? This is awful." Hank watched with concern as Catherine grabbed her 9th beer, but Big Chaw waved it off. "Let her be, Hank. She can handle herself." As the night grew darker, Catherine's condition continued to deteriorate. She could barely stand, using the wall for support. Despite her state, she stubbornly kept drinking. Eventually she fell back and dinged her head off of the metal railing. Hank sighed, shaking his head. "We should at least get her to sit down before she hurts herself." Big Chaw shrugged. "She'll tire herself out soon enough. Just let her be." Hank goes to help, but Big Chaw stops him and says, "This is normal." Hank stands by the side a little uncomfortable. He looks over at Big Chaw. Big Chaw grins and opens 2 beers. He then chugs both in less than 15 seconds. Catherine doesn't notice this, as she is currently too intoxicated. Big Chaw taps her on the shoulder and says, "Want to play a game?" Catherine says yes, but it's barely audible. Big Chaw hands her a beer and says who can finish one first. He counts down, and they both chug another full beer. Finally, her body gave in to the overwhelming alcohol, and she slumped over, unconscious. Big Chaw noticed her fall and let out a sigh. "Well, looks like she's out for the count," he said, standing up. He walked over to Catherine's limp form and grabbed her by the legs. Hank watched as Big Chaw effortlessly dragged Catherine up the porch steps and into the house. The mud left a trail behind her as she was pulled inside, her arms dragging along the ground. Once inside, Big Chaw positioned her on the old couch in the living room, making sure she was lying on her side to prevent any risk of choking. Big Chaw turned back to Hank. "She'll be fine after she sleeps it off. She's been through worse," he said with a shrug. He then grabbed a blanket and tossed it over Catherine. Hank is very upset with Big Chaw, but tries not to show it. Big Chaw stumbles back out onto the porch. Hank looked visibly upset with Big Chaw, but tried to mask his feelings. Big Chaw stumbled back out onto the porch and grabbed another beer. "Come on, Hank, lighten up. We're just having a good time," Big Chaw said, popping open another beer and downing it in a few gulps. "You worry too much." Hank shook his head, taking a more measured sip from his own bottle. "It's not about worrying too much, Chaw. You gotta think about the consequences." Big Chaw laughed, already cracking open another beer. "Consequences, huh? I've seen plenty, Hank. You just gotta roll with the punches." He downed to the second beer and reached for a third. "Look, I'm not trying to preach," Hank said, leaning back against the porch railing. "But Catherine's in bad shape." Big Chaw waved him off, taking a long swig. "She's tougher than she looks. Besides, it's her choice. Can't babysit everyone. She does that every day." Hank looked at Chaw in shock. Big Chaw shrugged, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "We all got our ways of dealing with things, Hank. Just let her be. She'll bounce back." He cracked open yet another beer, his fourth in this conversation alone. Hank could see the conversation was going nowhere. He took another sip of his beer, deciding it was best to let it go for now. Big Chaw clearly wasn't going to change his ways anytime soon. Big Chaw took another long drink, his eyes looking out into the night. "You know, it's good to have you back, Hank. Missed our talks." Big Chaw quickly stumbles from his seat and projectile vomits off of the porch. "Jesus, Chaw," Hank said, as he watched him spew violently off the porch. "Maybe you should slow down." Big Chaw wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, looking a bit embarrassed but still defiant. "Just a little too much too fast." "I'm fine. Really." Hank shook his head, feeling a mix of pity and frustration. "You sure about that?" Big Chaw nodded, though he didn't look quite as confident as before. Yeah, just need to catch my breath. Hand me another beer so I can wash this taste out my mouth." Hank hesitated for a moment, but ultimately reached for another beer and handed it to Big Chaw. "Here, just take it slow this time." Big Chaw took the beer, opening it with a practiced flick of his wrist. He took a careful sip, wincing slightly but managing to keep it down. "Thanks, brother." They sat in silence for a moment, the night sounds of the bayou filling the air around them. Finally, Hank broke the silence. "Chaw, why do you do this to yourself? Drinking this much? It's not healthy." Big Chaw sighed. "It's not just about the drinking. It's about forgetting. Sometimes you just need a break." Hank frowned. "Forgetting what?" Big Chaw took another sip of his beer. "Everything. The things I can't change. I just don't want to think about it all the time." Hank nodded slowly, understanding more than he cared to admit. "But at what cost, Chaw? Catherine's the same way, and it's not doing either of you any good." Big Chaw looked down at his beer, his expression somber. "I know. I see it in her, too. She's got her own demons, just like I do. We're not proud of it, but it's what we do." Hank took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I care about you." Big Chaw glanced at Hank. "I appreciate it, but change ain't easy. It feels like everything is better with a bottle in my hand. Hank leaned forward. I get it, Chaw, but you've got to try. For your own sake, hers too. You're stronger than you think. Big Chaw's smile faded, replaced by a scowl. Stronger, huh? How would you know? You think you're so damn wise coming back here after all these years and telling me how to live my life. He stood up, swaying slightly. You say you care so much. Where the hell did you go 4 years ago, huh? I don't know. Hank says quietly. Big Chaw's anger flared, his face turning red. You chose to leave, and you left me and everyone else behind, and moved on without us. Don't come back here and pretend like you care now. Hank clenched his fists and yelled, I came back, Chaw. The dramatic argument continues with the sound of Catherine's violent vomiting in the background. Big Chaw took a step closer, his eyes blazing. Help. You think you can waltz back into our lives like nothing changed. It's not that simple, Hank. You don't know what it's been like. Hank met Big Chaw's gaze, his voice steady. No, I don't. But I'm here now. Hank reached out, putting a hand on Big Chaw's shoulder. One step at a time, Chaw. We can start small. Maybe cut back a little. Find something else to focus on. You don't have to do it all at once. Big Chaw shook his head, his eyes filled with pain. Hank, you don't get it. I'm not the man I used to be. I used to have dreams, plans. Now I just get through the day. Hank says, What happened, Chaw? What changed? Big Chaw sighed deeply. I don't know. I used to be strong, Hank. Had hope, plans for the future, but then, I don't know. The time flew by. Big Chaw continued, his voice growing more desolate. I've spent most of my life in this town, Hank. Lugsville's all I've ever known. I thought I could make something of myself here, but it feels like I've been stuck in a never-ending cycle. I haven't left here much, but I guess I've just realized how much is really out there that I'm missing out on. Every day, I wake up and reach for a bottle to blur the edges of the reality I can't face. Hank's heart ached. What do you mean the reality you can't face? Chaw looks at Hank with tearful eyes and says, I'm 35 years old. I just thought I would do something important. Catherine and I, we're just two broken people trying to hold each other together. Catherine's only 25. She came here after trouble at home and never left. After a moment of silence, Big Chaw took a shaky breath. Catherine, she came here 2 years ago. She liked to drink, just like me. At first it was fun. She drank more than I did. I knew we had a problem, and eventually we tried to stop. She was able to stop, but I couldn't. I kept drinking, and I couldn't lose her. I begged her to stay with me. She tried to help me, but my weakness dragged her back into it. It's my fault. She fell back into drinking. I just wish I was who I used to be. Hank says, you are him, but is interrupted by Big Chaw. No, I'm not. There's a long moment of silence. Why did you come back? Don't lie to me. Hank pauses for a while and then says, I was being spied on by people. Not ordinary people. I didn't want them to hurt the people I loved, so I left. I figured they wouldn't follow me here. Big Chaw replies, so you risk bringing them here. Tomorrow night we leave. Hank says, we. Surprised at Chaw's response. Big Chaw says, yes, we. I'm going to come with you. I need to help you. For my sake. I need to do something with myself. All right then, Chaw. Me and you will head out tomorrow night. Thanks for having my back. April 16th, 2054, 11:30 a.m. Hank wakes up from the sun beaming through the window of Big Chaw's cabin. He sits up from the chair he fell asleep in. He looks over to see Big Chaw packing some things into a bag. He seemed happy almost. He walked over to Hank and said, "I'm all packed up for when we head out later. I'm ready to leave this town for a while." Dot after Big Chaw mentioned that he was ready to leave town for a while, Catherine's face froze in shock. "What do you mean, leave?" Big Chaw sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know, Cat, but I need a break from this place. It's been weighing me down, and I think it's time to move on for a bit." Catherine looked between Hank and Big Chaw. "But what about us? We've been here, sticking together. Now you just want to up and leave?" Hank, sensing the tension, stepped in. "Cat, it's not about leaving you behind. We're just trying to figure things out. Maybe get a fresh perspective." "You're serious about this?" Big Chaw nodded. "Yeah, Cat, I am. But it's not like we're cutting ties. We'll be back." Catherine frowned, then took a deep breath. "All right. If you're set on this, then let's make sure you don't just slip away. Let's make some plans. Have a good time before you go." "What do you have in mind?" Catherine's demeanor brightened slightly. "Tonight, at the Lug Lounge. We'll all get together, have a few drinks, and give you guys a proper send-off. It's not goodbye, just see you later." "What do you say?" Big Chaw hesitated, then nodded, a small smile forming. "Can't say no to that. We'll be there." Catherine smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Good. Then it's settled. Tonight, we make it a night to remember."
It's a big old fella, 6'7" tall. Got a heart of gold and a grin for all. Big Chaw's his buddy, been through thick and thin. At the Lug Lounge, that's where our tales begin. Rainy nights and dusty days, they've seen them all. From back road chases to near close calls. Tonight they're sitting beneath the neon glow in the Lug Lounge, where the troubles flow. At the Lug Lounge, that's where we drown, sipping whiskey, no worries around. With each clink of the glass, our stories resound. At the Lug Lounge, where lost souls are found.
As they continued through the Lug Lounge, Catherine led them to meet some of the town's more colorful characters, making sure Hank got to know the people who had become part of their lives here. Catherine led Hank and Big Chaw to a corner where an older man sat alone. He had a weathered face, deeply lined from years of hard living, and his clothes were worn and tattered. "That's Weeder," Big Chaw said to Hank. "He's been here for a while now. Come meet him." As they approached, Weeder looked up, squinting slightly. "New face," he muttered, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. "You with Chaw?" Hank nodded, extending his hand. "Hank, nice to meet you." Weeder shook Hank's hand, his grip firm despite the tremor in his hands. "Weeder. Used to be a farmer up north. Had a small place, nothing big, but it was mine." He paused, taking a sip of his drink. "Lost it all a few years back. Drought hit hard. Couldn't keep up with the bills. The bank took everything. Came down here hoping for a fresh start." Big Chaw nodded. Weeder's seen more than his share of hard times. Weeder snorted, Haven't we all? But this place, it's quiet. No one bothers you. No one asks questions. It's as close to peace as I'm gonna get. Hank nodded, understanding the sentiment. Thanks for the welcome, Weeder. Weeder waved it off. Just don't let this place take more from you than it gives, kid. Moving through the bar, Catherine pointed out another man, this one massive, easily 6'5", with broad shoulders and a thick beard. He was laughing with a few of the locals, his voice booming over the noise of the bar. Big Country, Catherine said. He came here a few years back. You'll want to meet him too. As they approached, Big Country turned, his eyes widening slightly as he took in Hank's size. Well, I'll be damned, he said with a grin. I thought I was the biggest guy in town, but you might just give me a run for my money. Hank chuckled, shaking Big Country's hand. Hank, nice to meet you. Big Country, he replied, still eyeing Hank with a grin. You know, it's not often I meet someone who makes me feel small. Catherine stepped in, her voice full of admiration. Hank here is a legend in Lugsville. You might have heard of him. He's the reigning chop buster. Big Country's eyes widened further. Is that right? I've heard stories, but I didn't think I'd meet the man himself. A challenge sparked in Big Country's eyes. How about we settle this right now? I've beaten every record here, but I've never faced the legendary buster of chops. Hank's smile widened. All right then. Let's see what you've got. Everyone in the lug lounge gathered around, sensing something exciting was about to unfold. Poppy Wintergreen, ever the showman, took to the makeshift stage at the center of the room. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have a special one. In one corner, we have the man who's made his mark with every slap. The undefeated legend of Lugsville, the man who we named the game after, with a record of 22-0, the chop buster Hank. And in the other corner, we have our very own undefeated powerhouse, with a record of 23-0, Big Country. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and the air was thick with anticipation. Big Country stepped forward, his grin confident as he prepared for the first slap. He cracked his knuckles, took a deep breath, and swung his arm with a powerful, resonant smack against Hank's cheek. The sound echoed through the bar, but Hank barely flinched, his expression as stoic as ever. Big Country winced slightly, feeling a jarring pain shoot through his hand. He shook it out, trying to ignore the discomfort, and gave Hank a nod to let him know he was ready for the next round. Big Country did not show it, but he could not believe what he had just felt. It was truly like smacking a brick wall. He was a bit afraid. Poppy Wintergreen leaned in close, his voice crackling with excitement. And there it is, folks. Big Country just gave it everything he had, but it looks like our chop buster is holding strong. Hank, with a calm demeanor, approached his turn. He carefully measured his strength, knowing he didn't want to hurt Big Country, just win. He swung his hand with precision, delivering a slap that was not too powerful and controlled. The impact was immediate, more forceful than intended. Big Country's eyes widened in shock. Big Country hit the floor immediately and fell unconscious. A moment of stunned silence filled the room as Big Country groaned on the floor. The crowd then erupted into cheers and applause, celebrating the dramatic knockout. Poppy Wintergreen raised his arms triumphantly. Ladies and gentlemen, the winner, the one, the only, the chop buster Hank. People crowding around Hank to congratulate him. Even Big Country, once he regained his senses, was grinning through the pain. He shook Hank's hand with his uninjured hand, albeit with a wince. "Well, I guess I've got some stories to tell now. You really lived up to your legend." He tried to continue speaking, but coughed up two of his teeth. "Well, damn," he said. Hank smiled, giving Big Country a friendly pat on the back. "Thanks. You got a good swing on you." Big Country left to go wash up and assess the damage. Big Chaw walked over. "Damn, you didn't need to hit him that hard." Jokingly, Hank replies that he really didn't try to. Catherine asks Hank, "So did they name this game after your nickname or something?" Hank replies, "Yeah, kinda, I guess, despite the accidental knockout and Big Country's injury." Hank's legendary status was even more solidified, and the night became another chapter of Lugsville's lore. Catherine later on pointed out a man who walked into the bar just then and put his head down at the counter, a drink in hand. His hair was white and unkempt, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Catherine leaned in close to Hank. "That's Dennis. He's been here for almost 3 years. Don't let the looks fool you. He's great, honestly." Hank approached cautiously, not wanting to startle the man. "Hey, Dennis. How are you?" Dennis lifted his head slowly, his eyes bloodshot. "Who's asking?" "Hank," he said, offering a hand. "I just got into town. Just meeting everyone." Dennis stared at the hand for a moment before shaking it weakly. "Dennis, I drink a lot." Catherine laughed lightly, trying to ease the tension. "Dennis came here to get away from some things, like most of us." Dennis sighed, rubbing his eyes. "Yeah, had a life once. A good job. Came here to disappear, I guess. Figured if I was going to drink myself to death, I might as well do it somewhere. No one would notice." He said, chuckling. Hank said, "Well, shit, at least you're still here, right?" Dennis looked at Hank. Dennis just made a noise and took another swig. Big Chaw put a hand on Dennis's shoulder. "Aren't we all, brother?" he said. "But the good times here make it worth it." Dennis nodded, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "Yeah, maybe that's enough." Dennis walked out. Dennis, Poppy, Catherine, and Big Chaw had drank together a few times, but were more like acquaintances. After the encounters at the Lug Lounge, Dennis left the bar with a heavy heart. His mind was clouded with thoughts of regret and hopelessness. He trudged back to his small home on the outskirts of town, a place that had become a symbol of failure. Inside his dimly lit living room, Dennis took a deep breath as he stared at the elephant rifle propped against the wall. It had been a gift from better days, a reminder of a time when he had hope and purpose. Now, it felt like a grim tool of escape. He sat down, clutching the rifle, his thoughts racing through the moments that led him to this point. The laughter, the sorrow, the endless cycle of drinking, it all seemed to blur together. He felt trapped in a life that no longer held any promise for him. In the silence of his home, Dennis prepared himself. The rifle was cold and heavy in his hands. As he took his final actions, he couldn't help but reflect on the fleeting moments of connection he had with others, like the brief conversation with Hank and the support from Big Chaw. Despite his feelings of isolation, he had, at least in part, been seen and heard. With tears streaming down his face, Dennis made the final irreversible decision. Dennis pulled the trigger. Rifle dropping to the floor, followed by an eerie quiet. Back at the Lug Lounge, the sound of gunfire echoed through the town. In a place where gunfire was strictly forbidden, everyone froze in shock. Catherine, Big Chaw, and Hank quickly realized that the shot came from Dennis's house on the outskirts. They rushed outside into the cool night air, heading towards Dennis's house. Catherine led the way, her hands shaking, with Big Chaw and Hank close behind. When they arrived, the front door of Dennis's house was slightly open. The smell of gunpowder and blood hit them as they stepped inside. Dennis lay lifeless on the floor, the rifle beside him. Catherine gasped, her face pale. Big Chaw stood quietly at the door, and Hank stood nearby, trying to process what had happened. Catherine knelt beside Dennis. Big Chaw closed his eyes, feeling the crushing weight of guilt. Hank put a hand on Big Chaw's shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. The group stood in the silent room. Catherine walked outside without a word. Big Chaw and Hank followed and watched as she went back to the lug lounge. Most of the people in the bar were outside waiting for an answer, but she just walked past them and went in. She grabbed the first beer she saw and chugged it. Big Chaw and Hank walked in shortly after, Big Chaw holding what is Dennis's elephant rifle. Hank says, "Why do you have that?" but is shushed by Big Chaw. Inside the lug lounge, everything felt different now. The excitement in the bar is now filled with an uneasy silence. Catherine sat alone at a corner table, chugging a beer as if it was the only thing keeping her steady. Big Chaw and Hank walked in, Big Chaw holding Dennis's elephant rifle, unsure of what to do. Catherine looked up from her drink, her eyes red. "You didn't have to bring that here." Big Chaw put the rifle down on a table. "I just didn't want it left behind." A little later that night, Big Chaw looked around the quiet bar, then sat down across from Catherine. Hank stayed standing, leaning against the wall, unsure of what to say. Catherine took another swig of her beer, avoiding their eyes. "What do we do now?" she asked. Big Chaw shrugged. "I don't know. Not much we can do. Dennis made his choice." Catherine shook her head. "Not that. I am very aware he's gone." The bar remained silent. Big Chaw reached for the beer, sitting in front of him. "I don't know what to say, Cat. It's a mess." Catherine nodded slowly, finishing her drink. "Yeah, it is." Big Chaw reached back for the rifle. "Can't just leave it here," as they made their way out of the lug lounge. The night air was cool. They walked in silence for a bit. Hank broke the silence. "Puppy wanted us to come down to his house." "I forgot to tell you," Big Chaw says. "What for?" And Hank replies saying, "Well, about, he said you guys had some sort of plan or something." Big Chaw says, "Oh, that I barely remember. That was more him than me." "I haven't thought about it since you left. Poppy's place wasn't far, just a short walk from the lug lounge. His house was a small, weathered building with a tin roof and a porch that creaked under any weight. A single light glowed faintly from inside. As they approached, Hank knocked on the door. "Poppy, you still up?" There was a brief pause before the door creaked open. Poppy Wintergreen, with his usual lively expression, peeked out. "What brings you to my humble abode at this hour?" "Hey, Poppy, I'm here about that plan you mentioned when I got here." Poppy looked up, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Yeah, that plan. I've been thinking about it a lot. Delmore is where you want to go." "What's Delmore got to do with anything?" Poppy leaned forward. "Delmore is a huge city, over 16 million people. It's always busy, and you can easily blend in there. If you're looking to disappear or just start over, that's the place. There's so much going on that you won't stand out." "You think it's a good move?" Poppy nodded. Definitely. It's your best chance if you want to stay under the radar. Delmore's got a different vibe from Lugsville. You can make a fresh start and not have to worry about everyone knowing your business. Hank nodded, considering Poppy's words. Sounds like it might be exactly what I need. Big Chaw nodded, but his expression went serious. There's a lot of danger, too. Delmore's got some serious gangs running the streets. They control a lot of areas, and they're not shy about showing it, I've heard. Poppy gave a stern nod. Just remember, be smart about it. Poppy leaned back, adding, Yeah, the gangs there are no joke. They're known for being evil sons of bitches, and they've got that city. You've got to be careful where you go and who you talk to. If you get on the wrong side of them, it's not pretty. Catherine's face softened a bit. The city's big. We can find our place, I'm sure. Poppy Wintergreen looked at the group with surprise. I thought it was just Hank going. Are you all set on this? Big Chaw nodded firmly. Yes, we need a change too. Hank leaned in, addressing Poppy directly. What's the deal with Delmore? Poppy rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Delmore's a massive place full of people. You won't have trouble fitting in. Trust me, Catherine adds in, and so many skyscrapers. There's the Dice Tower. It's the second tallest building in the world. It's like 1,400 meters. Catherine added, I used to read about Delmore all the time. It's dangerous, but it's so futuristic. Catherine seemed very excited. It's crazy there. Hank said, we don't have money right now, but we'll figure things out when we get there. We'll find a place to stay and look for work. Hank looked at Big Chaw and Catherine. I'd like to catch up with Pushrod before we head out. Is he still hanging around the river? Big Chaw nodded. Yeah, he's probably down there. Before heading to the river, Hank gave Poppy a firm handshake and said, Thanks for everything. I'd say we will be in touch if you had a phone, but you don't. Poppy nodded. Stay safe out there. If you need anything, you know where to find me, even though you're going to be pretty far. Catherine added, I'll miss this place, but it's time for a change. Good luck with everything. Big Chaw, placing a hand on Poppy's shoulder, said, Yeah, take care of yourself. I need this change too. With their farewells said, they turned and made their way down the muddy street toward the river, each lost in their own thoughts about the journey ahead. As they approached the river, they saw Pushrod sitting alone by a fire with a bottle of moonshine. The warm light flickered on his weathered face, and he squinted at the newcomers. Hank yells, Hey, Push! Pushrod looks over, trying to focus his eyes. Hank, is that really you? Pushrod slurred, sitting up a bit. Yeah, it's me, Hank said, taking a seat beside him. We're heading out soon and wanted to catch up. I was only here a short while. Pushrod's eyes widened. Leaving town? Where are you going? Delmore, Big Chaw said, settling down by the fire. Time for a change. Thought we'd say goodbye before we go. Pushrod's face lit up with surprise. Delmore, huh? That's something. You're all going. Hank chuckled, yes, but I just remembered. Remember that time Big Chaw was up on the roof of his house trying to fix the chimney after a few too many drinks? He lost his balance and ended up falling face first onto the railing on his stairs. Oh man, I thought we were going to have to bury you. Big Chaw grinned. Yeah, I'm lucky. Pushrod laughed. I remember that. I was sure you were done for, Chaw, but you eventually walked it off. Big Chaw shrugged. Just another day in the life, I guess. Catherine watched with a smile, but her expression grew tense as Pushrod continued. "Oh, and there was that time I set a bear trap out in the woods," Pushrod said, leaning in with a chuckle. "I was trying to catch something for dinner, but I didn't realize some kid from out of town had wandered into the area. He stepped right into the trap. We did have to bury him. We didn't tell anyone about it, though. Too messy of a story." Hank burst into laughter, slapping his knee, yelling, "Oh my God, that poor kid." Big Chaw joined in, laughing harder than he intended. "A kid, huh? I remember that. We were all like, well, guess we've got an unexpected guest for dinner." "I bet Hank thought about eating him," he said, laughing. Hank said, Yeah, sure, I would never." "Or would I?" he said jokingly. Pushrod chuckled along, clearly amused by the memory. "Yeah, we had to act quick. Didn't want to cause a fuss." Catherine's smile faded as she looked at them. "That's awful." Hank tried to calm himself, still chuckling. "Yeah, it wasn't the best at times, but we made do." Big Chaw wiped a tear from his eye, trying to stop laughing. "We got through it, though. Just another story for the books." Catherine shook her head, her concern obvious. "I hope you all realize how serious that was." "Are you guys joking?" Big Chaw says, "No, we ain't joking, but what can you do?" Hank adds in and says, "Well, it's sad that he died, but we can't change it now." Catherine decided to ignore it for now. They spent the rest of the night around the fire, passing a bottle between them and talking about old times. The conversation drifted back to Delmore, and the mood shifted. "Delmore is not like here," Hank said. "Heard there's been shootings, people going missing. An explosion killed almost 20 people just last week. The gangs want power so bad. They did something to the water supply just a few months ago, and it still ain't completely solved. Only about 70% of the water around there is safe." Pushrod nodded, his speech a bit slurred. "Gang war," they said. "Last month, 23 dead in one shootout. City's rough, man. Different kind of life. Also odd. We almost never hear anything about the place anymore. No news coverage. For what's happening, you would think it would be everywhere. And I don't go online much at all. Shit, even people around here was talking about it, and I think only Catherine, me, and Big Country get online ever. Sick of all the AI shit." Big Chaw stared into the fire. "Maybe that's what we need, though. A change. Ain't nothing here for us anymore." Pushrod thought about joining them. "Delmore, huh? Nah, I'm too old for that kind of mess, but you guys, you're still young enough to handle it." Hank leaned in closer. "You know, Push, you're one of the very few people who know what I can do. It's not safe for me to stay here anymore. If I do, I could attract unwanted attention to everyone around me. That's why I'm leaving so soon." Pushrod thought for a moment, his expression serious despite the alcohol. "I get it, Hank. It's tough. But you gotta do what's best for you and everyone here." A few minutes later, Hank says, lowering his voice a bit, "Did you hear that gunshot earlier?" Push said, "Yeah, thought it was just someone messing around. What happened?" Hank sighed. "It wasn't just messing around. Dennis shot himself. We found him at his place, rifle on the floor." Pushrod looked surprised. "Damn, Dennis, I didn't think he'd go that way." "None of us did," Hank replied. "It's been a rough night. That's part of why we're heading out. It's time for a change." As the fire crackled softly beside them, the conversation began to slow. The night was growing colder, and the weight of what lay ahead pressed on them all. "We should get going," he said. Big Chaw stood up, brushing off his pants. Yeah, time to hit the road. Catherine gave a small nod, though her mind seemed elsewhere. The thought of leaving Lugsville behind wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Pushrod stayed seated. He looked up at Hank. Protect them, he said. Hank met his eyes and nodded. I will. The firelight flickered over Poosh's face. Be careful in Delmore, Poosh added, his voice quiet. That place ain't like here. Hank knew that all too well, but he didn't say anything more. The three of them exchanged their final goodbyes with Pushrod, who remained by the fire as they walked away. The night air was chilly as they made their way back through the muddy streets of Lugsville. No one spoke, each of them lost in their own thoughts. They were leaving everything behind. It was midnight at this point, just turning over into the next day. April 17th, 2054. As they walk down the path leaving Lugsville, Hank asks, So, ID this place in Georgia or Florida? Catherine says it's in Florida, the very top east part, where Miramar Beach used to be, and Fort Wallace Beach. But everything in that area has been redone, renamed, and built up for like 20 years now, surprisingly fast. Hank says I don't know those places anyways. He then mentioned that they could take the bus there unless one of them had a car. Since neither of them did, Hank explained that he had money in his bag for food, the bus ride, and an apartment for a short while. However, they would need to find work once they arrived. Hank, Catherine, and Big Chaw set out from Lugsville just before dawn. They walked briskly along the deserted roads, the air cool and crisp. After a couple of hours, they reached Brookside, a small town about 12 miles away from Lugsville. The town was still quiet as they approached the bus station. It was a modest building, open early enough for the few travelers that might pass through. Hank went inside and approached the counter, pulling out the cash he had. We need 3 tickets to Delmore. What time's the next bus? The clerk, a middle-aged woman with a friendly smile, checked the schedule. There's a bus to that direction in about 2 hours at 5, but you won't get there in one trip. Hank nodded, relieved. Great, we'll take those. They paid for the tickets and then took a seat in the waiting area. The station was small but nice, with a few benches and a vending machine. Catherine stretched out her legs and looked around. This is the only place we ever come to shop besides Lugsville. Not much choice here, huh? I've never been in her, though, Big Chaw mentioned. Yeah, I don't leave Lugsville much. Feels like there's not a lot of options. Later on, Catherine, with a few dollars in her pocket, went up to the vending machine. How do I work this thing, she says. The clerk says it's card-only, hun. Catherine says, well, what the fuck is that shit? Hank walked over to be sure and said, yeah, almost all of them are like that now. But something inside the vending machine caught his eye. A reddish-maroon can with the words Pib Extra on it. The flavor was spicy cherry. Catherine noticed also and gagged at the thought of it. Catherine laughingly says, what kind of freak would drink Pib Extra? Big Chaw leans over to see with a disgusted look on his face. 1 hour later, Catherine mentions, I didn't think it was this bad, noticing her hands shaking. I need to get a little alcohol in just to calm down. Hank looked at her. I get it. There's a small store a few blocks from here. Maybe we can find something small to help. Catherine gave a grateful smile. Thanks. Big Chaw looked around the small station. I'll keep an eye on our stuff while you guys go. Hank and Catherine stepped out of the station into the quiet early morning. The streets of Brookside were starting to come alive, with a few people opening their shops and early risers starting their day. They walked briskly, making their way to the small store Hank had mentioned. Inside the store, Catherine went straight to the alcohol section and picked out a small bottle of whiskey. She paid for it and took a deep breath, feeling a bit more relaxed as they left the store. As they walked back to the bus station, Catherine took a drink from the bottle. "I hope this helps," she said, her nerves already beginning to settle. When they got back to the station, the bus was pulling up. They quickly boarded and found their seats, settling in for the long ride. The bus pulls out, and they begin their ride to Delmore. As they all sit at the back, Big Chaw looks to Hank and says, "I wonder if anyone else has a life as crazy as ours." Hank replies, "Maybe somewhere out there." Eight months earlier, September 17th, 2053. A large man roared down the road on his black motorcycle, the engine's deep rumble cutting through the night. His brown turtleneck leather jacket flapped in the wind, and his slicked-back black hair gleamed under the streetlights, along with a thick black mustache shadowing his face. The loud music from his stereo blared, echoing off the empty streets as he sped down them. This man's name was Daniel Smith.